Dominic Bruno treated loyalty like a ledger entry, bought with cash or paid for with blood. Pushing open the unlocked back door of his estranged parents' crumbling row house, he braced for the smell of mildew and forgotten prescriptions. Instead, the scent of toasted garlic hit him like a physical blow. Sitting at the table wasn't a hitman. It was an exhausted 26-year-old woman wearing a faded Target sweatshirt, patiently wiping marinara sauce off his father's trembling chin. The rain in South Philadelphia didn't fall. It settled. It coated the brick of the narrow row houses in a greasy, dark sheen that smelled of wet asphalt and old diesel. Dominic sat in the back of the idling Lincoln, his eyes fixed on the green wooden door of number 44. His knuckles were still slightly swollen from a conversation 3 nights ago in a warehouse near the docks, a conversation involving a pair of bolt cutters and a man who thought skimming 3% off the South Side concrete contracts was an invisible crime. Dominic's jaw ticked. The streets quiet? In the driver's seat, Dean didn't look back. He just checked his side mirror, his jaw working a piece of nicotine gum. Clear, boss. 2 kids on bicycles 3 blocks down. Nobody sitting in parked cars. It's just Tuesday. Keep the engine running. Dominic stepped out into the drizzle. He didn't use an umbrella. In his line of work, holding an umbrella meant occupying one of your hands with something that couldn't stop a 9mm round. He wore a dark, charcoal overcoat that cost more than the blue book value of the 3 sedans parked on the curb combined. He hadn't been to number 44 in 8 months. The last time he'd come, his father, Sam, had thrown a ceramic mug at his chest. "Take your blood money and buy a plot in hell," the old man had rasped, his voice shredded by 40 years of breathing drywall dust and unfiltered Pall Malls. Dominic had left the envelope of cash on the hallway radiator anyway. He always did. And every month, Dean would check the city tax registry to make sure the property taxes on number 44 were quietly paid off through a shell LLC. Dominic reached the porch. The floorboards gave a soft, familiar groan under his boots. He reached into his coat, his right hand wrapping around the checkered grip of the Sig Sauer tucked into his waistband, his thumb resting instinctively on the safety. He didn't knock. He turned the brass knob. It gave. Unlocked. A cold spike of adrenaline hit the base of his skull. In a neighborhood where kids stole the copper piping out of vacant basements, nobody left a front door unlatched. Dominic pushed the door open an inch. No sound of ransacking. No smell of copper or cordite. Instead, there was the smell of toasted garlic, simmering crushed tomatoes, dried oregano. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him with the silent, practiced weight of his shoulder. The narrow hallway was dim, the faded wallpaper peeling near the baseboards where the winter damp got in. He moved toward the kitchen light at the end of the hall, his boots making zero sound on the threadbare runner. He reached the doorframe and stopped. His father was sitting in his usual vinyl-backed chair. Sam's left hand was resting on the table, tremor shaking so violently that the spoon beside his bowl was tapping a erratic, metallic rhythm against the formica. Standing over him wasn't a visiting nurse in a pair of crisp blue scrubs. It was a young woman. Her dark hair was hoisted up into a messy knot, held together by a cheap plastic claw clip that was missing 2 of its teeth. She wore a grey sweatshirt with a faded logo of a high school track team she looked 10 years too old to have ran for. "Sam, look at me," she was saying. Her voice wasn't the high-pitched, patronizing sing-song people used on toddlers and the dying. It was flat, grounded, the voice of a woman who had already explained something twice today and was prepared to explain it a 3rd time without losing her temper. "You try to hoist the bowl, you're going to wear the minestrone. Put your hand flat. Good. Now, let the spoon come to you." She guided a plastic spoonful of broth to the old man's mouth. Sam took it, his jaw working slowly. "Good," she said. At the other end of the small table sat Dominic's mother, Connie. She had a pair of reading glasses perched on the very tip of her nose, her finger tracing the lines of an electric bill. Beside her sat a little boy, maybe 6 years old, with a mop of unruly brown hair, furiously colouring a drawing of a Tyrannosaurus Rex with a blunt green crayon. "Tess, honey," Connie said, her voice thin. "This says the delivery charge went up $12. How does the electricity cost $12 just to get here? Does it take a taxi?" The woman, Tess, didn't look up from Sam's chin as she dabbed it with a paper towel. "It's a grid adjustment fee, Connie. They tack it on in November, so when you turn the heat on in January, you don't notice the jump. I'll call them on my lunch break tomorrow and tell them you're on the fixed income senior tier. They'll knock $8 off." "God bless you, Teresa," Connie sighed. Dominic shifted his weight. A floorboard beneath the linoleum let out a sharp clack. 4 heads turned. The little boy dropped his green crayon. It rolled across the table and fell off the edge, bouncing once on the floor. Connie's hand flew to her collar. "Dominic!" Sam didn't look up. He just stared at his bowl of soup, his shaking hand suddenly going rigid against the table, his knuckles turning white. Dominic didn't look at his parents. His eyes locked onto Tess. In his world, when a stranger was caught in a room they didn't belong in, they did one of 3 things. They reached for a weapon, they threw their hands up and started talking fast, or their eyes darted to the nearest window to calculate the drop. Tess did none of those things. She kept the plastic spoon in her right hand. She took half a step to her left, a tiny, imperceptible shift of her sneakers that put her own body directly between Dominic's 6'2" frame and the little boy sitting at the table. Her eyes didn't go wide. They narrowed. She looked at his tailored coat, took in the slight bulge at his waist, looked at his cold, dead-level stare, and her face settled into an expression of profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "You're the son," she said. It wasn't a question. "Put the spoon down," Dominic said. His voice was a low, gravelly register that usually made grown men in union halls look at their shoes. Tess looked at the spoon in her hand, then looked back at him. "He hasn't finished the carrots." "I said put it down." "Donnie, shut your mouth!" Sam growled at the table. The old man didn't lift his head, but his voice carried the stubborn, flinty weight that had defined Dominic's entire childhood. "You come into this house after 8 months. You don't give orders to the girl. She's the only reason your mother didn't break her hip on the ice last Tuesday." Dominic ignored his father. He unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his overcoat, stepping fully into the kitchen. The room suddenly felt half its normal size. He pulled out one of the wooden chairs opposite the little boy, turned it around, and sat down, straddling it, his forearms resting on the backrest. He looked at the kid. The boy was staring at Dominic's bruised right hand. "What's your name?" Dominic asked the boy. "Sammy," the kid whispered. "Go watch the television in the front room, Sammy," Tess said. She didn't raise her voice, but there was a steel rod running through the center of it. "Take your dinosaur." The boy grabbed his paper and scrambled off the chair, his light-up sneakers flashing red as he bolted down the hallway. Dominic turned his gaze back to Tess. She was still standing by Sam. "Who do you work for?" "Myself," she said. "Which agency?" "The agency quit coming in September," Connie said, her voice trembling slightly as she folded her hands over the electric bill. "The girl they sent, the one with the red car, she said the parking was too bad, and then somebody broke her passenger window down on Wharton Street. The office told us they didn't have any staff willing to take the South Side route anymore." Dominic felt a cold flush of genuine rage hit his chest. He paid a premium health concierge service in Center City $4,000 a month to manage his parents' home care. The fact that an agency had quietly dropped them off a route map and kept cashing his automated clearinghouse drafts was a mistake somebody was going to answer for with their dental records by Friday. "So who are you?" Dominic asked Tess. "I live at 48, she said, 2 doors down. And you just walk in here and play nurse?" Your mother was trying to haul a 12-pack of Scott tissue up the porch steps in the freezing rain while holding a walker, mister," Tess said. She crossed her arms over her faded track sweatshirt. "I took the paper. Then I came inside because the house smelled like gas. Your dad had left the back burner on low without a flame for 3 hours trying to warm up a kettle." Dominic's eyes flicked to the stove. "I check on them before my shift," Tess continued, her tone strictly transactional. "And I come back at 4 to make sure Sam takes his Cinemet on an active stomach, because if he takes it on an empty stomach, he throws up, and your mother can't lift him off the bathroom tile anymore." Dominic sat in silence for 5 seconds. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the ancient Whirlpool refrigerator. In Dominic's head, the universe was a double-entry bookkeeping ledger. Everything had a cost. If a man offered you a drink, he wanted an introduction. If a man offered you a tip on a shipment, he wanted a cut of the hijack. Nobody spent 3 hours a day smelling like somebody else's parents' old soup for free. He stood up. He walked over to the refrigerator and pulled the door open. Inside, the shelves were stacked. There was a carton of Lactaid milk, 3 containers of store-brand low-sodium chicken broth, a bag of fresh spinach, 2 dozen eggs in a grey cardboard flat, a package of ground turkey with a yellow reduced price. Quicksame sticker slapped across the plastic. He recognized his mother's grocery habits. She bought whatever was on the front page of the circular, but she hadn't left the house in months. He closed the fridge door and turned around. "Who paid for the groceries?" Connie looked down at her lap. "We gave her the cash from the jar, Donnie. The jar has 84 cents in it, Connie," Tess said quietly. She looked at Dominic, her chin coming up an inch. "I bought them. It's fine." "How much?" Dominic asked. "It doesn't matter." Dominic reached into his trousers. He pulled out a black leather money clip bound around a stack of $100 bills thick enough to choke a dog. He peeled off 500s and dropped them onto the Formica table right over the spot where the kid had been drawing his dinosaur. "That covers the groceries," Dominic said. "And your time. Don't come back here again. I'll have a private nurse stationed in the front room by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Tess looked down at the 5 crisp green bills. She didn't gasp. She didn't look insulted. She reached out with 2 fingers, slid one of the $100 bills toward herself, picked it up, and held it out to him. "The turkey was $6.50. The eggs were $3.20. The milk was $4, she said. "Give me a 20 and a 5, and take this back. I don't carry hundreds. The bodega down the street thinks they're counterfeit, and the gas station won't make change for anything over a 50. Dominic stared at the bill in her hand. "Take the 500. "No, I don't like owing people," Dominic said, his voice dropping into that dangerous quiet place. "And I don't like guys who drop $500 on a kitchen table like they're tipping a stripper," Tess said. The silence that followed was absolute. Sam let out a dry, rattling wheeze that might have been a laugh if his lungs had the capacity for it. Tess didn't flinch. She let the $100 bill flutter out of her fingers back onto the table. She reached over, grabbed her little boy's green crayon off the floor, put it in her pocket, and walked toward the hall. "The Cinemet is on the counter," she said to Connie as she passed. 2 pills at 6 o'clock. Don't let him drink grapefruit juice with it." The front door clicked shut. Dominic stood in the center of his parents' kitchen, staring at the $500 sitting on the table. For the first time in 10 years, he felt entirely, stupidly broke. The rain had turned into a hard, driving sleet by 11 o'clock that night. Dominic sat in the rear of the Lincoln, parked across the street from a sprawling, windowless brick complex in the industrial sector of the city. A massive, faded sign above the loading bays read, "Apex Industrial Linen and Hospital Supply." Every 6 minutes, a massive white cloud of sulfur and bleach-scented steam billowed out of the side exhaust vents, rolling across the wet asphalt of the alley. The passenger door opened, letting in a blast of freezing air and the smell of wet wool as Dean slid into the front seat. He wiped his face with a fast food napkin and tossed a manila folder into Dominic's lap. "You were right," Dean said, putting the Lincoln back into drive but keeping his foot on the brake. "She's a ghost, but she's a local one." Dominic opened the folder. The glow from his smartphone illuminated a blurry Pennsylvania driver's license photo. Teresa Marie Kincaid, age 26. Born at Methodist Hospital. Dean recited, staring out the windshield at the factory doors. Graduated Furnace High. Married a guy named Corey Kincaid when she was 19. Corey was a drywaller who liked video poker and methamphetamines. He took off 4 years ago for Arizona, left her with a $3,000 medical debt for a broken collarbone. His or hers, the file doesn't say. And the kid. Dominic stared at the photo. In the picture, her hair was down, but the eyes were the same. Tired. Assessing. She works the 2 to 11 shift here. Dean continued. Loads industrial washing drums with hospital bedding and hotel sheets. $12.50 an hour. Takes home roughly $1,600 a month after taxes. Dominic turned the page. There was a printout of a property deed for number 48. "That's the interesting part," Dean said, tapping the steering wheel. "Her building is owned by a guy named Grigory Vlasov." Dominic's thumb stopped halfway down the page. "The Russian?" "The very same," Dean said. "Grigory's been buying up the foreclosed row houses on that block for 3 years, turning them into multi-unit rentals without pulling zoning permits. I had a guy at the magistrate's office pull the ledger. Tess Kincaid is 2 months behind on her rent. $900 a month, plus Grigory tax on a $50 late processing fee. Every Friday the balance isn't zeroed out." Dominic looked out the tinted window at the heavy iron doors of the linen plant. "How much does she owe him total?" $2,150, Dean said. And Grigory's collector, that big idiot with the glass eye, Igor, was sitting on her front porch yesterday afternoon when she got home from your mother's place. Neighbor said he sat there eating sunflower seeds for an hour just watching her kid play on the sidewalk. Dominic felt a slow, dark heat start to pool in his stomach. It wasn't altruism. Dominic didn't believe in the concept. It was a matter of jurisdiction. Tess Kincaid had put $30 worth of groceries into his mother's refrigerator. That made her an active asset on his side of the board. A low-level bottom feeder like Grigory sending a gorilla to sit on the porch of an asset connected to the Bruno family was a failure of respect. And in Dominic's ecosystem, a failure of respect was an infectious disease that had to be cauterized immediately. "Look," Dean muttered, nodding toward the alley. The heavy steel side door of the linen plant groaned open. A dozen women in the heavy winter coats hurried out into the sleet, their heads ducked, making a line for the employee parking lot. Tess was the last one out. She wore a bright yellow, cheap plastic rain poncho over her winter coat. She was walking with a slight limp, the kind of stiff-hipped gait that comes from standing on concrete for 9 hours straight. She reached a faded 2011 Honda Civic parked near the chain-link fence. The front passenger fender was different shade of grey than the rest of the car, a scrapyard replacement. She unlocked the door, got in, and the headlights flickered on. Dominic watched. The engine turned over. Cha-cha-cha! Then it died. She tried it again. Cha-cha-cha-cha! Click, click, click! The headlights dimmed to a sickly pale yellow. Inside the car, through the streaked glass of the windshield, Dominic saw her rest her forehead directly against the top of the steering wheel. She didn't hit the dash. She didn't scream. She just stayed there, perfectly still, letting the sleet tick against the roof of her dead car for 10 seconds. "Pull up," Dominic said. "Boss!" "Pull the car up alongside her, Dean." The Lincoln glided across the empty, wet street, its massive tires cutting through the slush. Dean pulled up so close to the driver's side of the Civic that Tess couldn't have opened her door more than 6 inches. Dominic pressed the button on the armrest. The rear tinted window slid down silently, letting the icy, freezing rain hit his face. Tess lifted her head from the steering wheel. She looked at the massive black sedan, recognized the chrome trim, and rolled her own manual window down 3 inches. "You're following me now?" she asked. Her breath plumed white in the narrow gap between the vehicles. "Your alternator's gone," Dominic said. "It's the battery terminal. It gets loose when it gets below 30 degrees. I just have to tap it with a wrench. Open the door, Tess. I have to pick Sammy up from Mrs. Gable's house in 20 minutes, mister," she said, her voice cracking just a fraction of an hour at the very edge. "It's 3 miles away. If I'm late after midnight, she charges me double for the overnight sitting." "Dean," Dominic said, without looking away from her. "Call Sam's auto on Passyunk. Tell them to send a flatbed here right now. Put the Civic on Dominic Bruno's tab." Tess's eyes flashed in the dark. "I didn't ask you for a tow—" "Get in the car," Dominic said. "No, your kid left his green crayon on my mother's kitchen floor," Dominic said, his voice entirely flat, devoid of any Hollywood charm or warmth. "My father wants to know when you're bringing him back to finish the dinosaur. Get in the car, Tess. I'm not asking you twice." She stared at him through the falling sleet. For 3 long seconds, the pride of a woman who had survived 4 years of solo warfare fought against the sheer, crushing gravity of a dead battery in the middle of a winter storm. She reached down, grabbed her canvas tote bag off the passenger seat, pushed her door open against the side of the Lincoln, and climbed into the back seat. The door slammed shut. The Lincoln smelled of rich, dry leather and expensive cedar wood. Tess smelled of industrial bleach and damp cotton. She sat as far to the left against the door as humanly possible, staring straight ahead at the back of Dean's headrest. "Where's the sitter's house?" Dean asked quietly. 412 McKean, she said. The Lincoln pulled away from the curb. Dominic didn't look at her, but as the streetlights of the industrial district washed over the interior of the car, he noticed her right hand. She was holding her little boy's blunt green crayon so hard her knuckles were trembling. The heater in the Lincoln blew a steady stream of dry, climate-controlled warmth, but Tess kept her arms locked tightly across her chest. She watched the wet row houses slide past the window. Neither of them spoke for the 4 minutes it took to reach McKean Street. When Dean pulled the massive sedan against the curb behind a rusted plumbing van, Tess had her hand on the door handle before the tires even stopped rolling. "Stay in the car," she said to the glass. She didn't look at Dominic. She just shoved her door open into the driving sleet and hurried up the narrow concrete steps of a narrow brick house with a glowing yellow porch light. Dominic watched through the rain-streaked window. The front door opened. An older woman in a thick quilted housecoat stood in the frame. There was a brief, sharp exchange of words, the universal midnight choreography of working mothers and exhausted babysitters. Tess reached into her tote bag, pulled out a small envelope of cash, and handed it over. A moment later, she turned back towards the street. She was carrying Sammy. The boy was asleep, his head slumped heavily over her shoulder, his legs dangling in a pair of faded sweatpants that had been washed so many times the navy blue had turned a dusty charcoal. Tess had wrapped her own yellow plastic rain poncho around his back to keep the freezing rain off his neck. She was taking the porch steps sideways, her stiff hip catching on the second drop. Dominic reached for his door handle. "Boss?" Dean warned from the front seat, his eyes on the rearview mirror. "You step out there, you're just going to make her madder." "Keep the heater cranked," Dominic said. He stepped out into the sleet. The shock of the cold air felt good against his skin. It cleared the smell of old hospital laundry out of his nose. He met Tess at the bottom of the steps, reaching out without saying a word to take the boy's weight off her chest. Tess jerked back, her wet sneakers slipping an inch on the icy sidewalk. "Don't touch him. You're going to drop him on the concrete, Tess," Dominic said. His voice wasn't gentle. It was a flat statement of physics. "Give me the kid. Get in the car." She looked at his face, rain dripping from the brim of her hair down her nose. Her chest heaved once, a ragged, shallow intake of air. She didn't say thank you. She just leaned forward and let Dominic slide his hands under Sammy's arms. The boy weighed almost nothing. 40 pounds of warm, sleeping kid, smelling faintly of cheap cherry cough syrup and peanut butter. Dominic held him against his tailored charcoal overcoat, felt the slow, steady rise and fall of the boy's chest against his ribs, and walked him around to the open door of the Lincoln. He laid Sammy across the leather seats. Tess climbed in beside him immediately, pulling the boy's head onto her lap, shielding him with her body as if Dominic might suddenly decide to hold the kid for ransom. Dominic got into the front passenger seat, slamming the door against the storm. "Take us to 48. The drive back took less than 3 minutes. The neighborhood was dead. The only people out were the city salt trucks grinding down Broad Street 3 blocks away, their orange strobe lights painting the low-hanging clouds a sickly, violent shade of amber. When they pulled up outside number 48, Dominic looked up at the second-floor windows. Dark. "The boiler's off," Dominic said. "It's on a timer," Tess said, her voice muffled as she smoothed Sammy's damp hair back from his forehead. "Gregory shuts it down at 10 to save on heating oil. It kicks back on at 5 in the morning. It's 22 degrees outside. We have an electric space heater in the bedroom. It's fine." She opened the door, maneuvering Sammy's sleeping weight backward out of the car. Dominic didn't offer to help this time. He knew when a line had been drawn in the dirt. He sat in the front seat and watched her carry her son across the slush-covered sidewalk, push open the heavy wooden door of the apartment building with her shoulder, and disappear into the dark entryway. "Dean," Dominic said. "Yeah, boss?" "Leave the car running. Give me 5 minutes." Dominic stepped out into the weather for the 3rd time that night. He walked across the sidewalk and pushed the entry door open. The hallway of number 48 smelled of boiled cabbage, wet plaster, and old cigarettes. It was colder inside than it was out on the street, the kind of damp, trapped cold that settles into the marrow of your bones. A single, naked 40-watt bulb hung from a frayed wire on the second-floor landing. Dominic climbed the stairs, his boots silent on the rotting rubber treads. At the top of the stairs, apartment 2B faced the landing. The door was thin interior plywood, the kind of cheap hollow-core door you buy at a hardware store for $60. A heavy kick would take it off its hinges. Taped right above the brass doorknob was a bright pink sheet of paper. Dominic didn't need to turn on his phone flashlight to read the bold black print at the top. 10-day notice to quit and vacate. Beneath it was a scrawled signature in blue ballpoint pen, G. Vlasov. And at the bottom, handwritten in neat, blocky Cyrillic letters, was an added note. Dominic didn't read Russian, but he recognized the numbers. $2,150 by Friday noon, or the locks change. Dominic reached out, gripped the edge of the pink paper, and stripped it off the wood. The cheap Scotch tape made a sharp shk sound in the quiet hallway. From inside the apartment, he heard the faint metallic clink of a deadbolt sliding into place. Dominic folded the pink notice twice, slipped it into the inside pocket of his overcoat right next to his Sig Sauer, and walked back down the stairs. Grigory Vlasov ran his rental operations out of the back office of an auto salvage yard on Snyder Avenue. It was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence, topped with concertina wire, and guarded by 2 German shepherds that lived entirely on raw chicken backs and spite. At 2 o'clock the next afternoon, the winter sun was a pale, cold smear behind the refinery smog. Dominic's Lincoln didn't park on the street. Dean drove it straight through the open chain-link gates, the tires crunching over frozen gravel and discarded oil filters, pulling up directly in front of the corrugated metal office building. The 2 shepherds came charging out from behind a stack of rusted Ford Ranger truck beds, barking furiously, their breath plumed white. Dean stepped out of the driver's side first. He wasn't wearing an overcoat, just a heavy black Carhartt jacket. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick, frozen knuckle of beef bone he'd bought at the Italian market an hour earlier, and tossed it 12 feet to the left. The dog skidded in the slush, snapped up the bone, and trotted off under a wrecked sedan to fight over it. Dominic got out of the passenger side. He adjusted his leather gloves. The metal door of the office banged open. Igor stepped out onto the concrete landing. He was 6'4", wearing a stained puffer vest over a grey sweatshirt. His left eye was a cloudy, fixed marble that stared blankly at the sky, while his right eye tracked Dominic with stupid, animal hostility. "Yard's closed," Igor grunted. His accent was thick, his jaw working a toothpick. "No retail parts today." Dominic didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at Igor's face. "Tell Grigori that Dominic Bruno is here to pay a tenant's utility bill." Igor's right eye narrowed. He shifted his weight, his massive hand dropping toward the pocket of his vest. Dean closed the distance between them in 2 seconds flat. There was no theatrical wind-up. Dean just stepped inside Igor's reach, drove the steel-reinforced toe of his work boot directly into the big man's left kneecap with a sickening, wet crack, and caught Igor by the throat as he folded forward. Dean shoved the giant backward into the metal doorframe, pinning him there with a forearm across his windpipe. "Don't touch your pockets, big guy," Dean whispered, his tone entirely conversational. "You'll pull back a stump." Dominic stepped past them both, pushed the interior door open, and walked into the office. The room was overheated, smelling faintly of kerosene and cheap instant coffee. Grigory Vlasov sat behind a battered steel desk covered in receipts, titles, and a half-eaten sleeve of saltine crackers. He was a small, round man with thinning grey hair plastered to his skull and a cheap gold chain resting against the collar of his velour tracksuit. When he saw Dominic step through the door, his hands froze over the keyboard of his ancient desktop computer. "Dominic!" Grigory said. His voice was too loud, too bright. "To what do I owe the honor? You need titles cleared? I have 3 clean sedans coming from the auction in Jersey tomorrow." Dominic pulled the wooden visitor's chair out from the wall, sat down, and unbuttoned his coat. He reached into his inside pocket, pulled out the folded pink eviction notice, and tossed it onto the center of Grigory's desk, right on top of the saltines. Grigory looked down at the paper. A tiny bead of sweat materialized at his temple, despite the freezing draft coming through the open door behind Dominic. "This is a mistake," Gregory stammered, his fingers twitching toward the notice. "The girl. She is 2 months delinquent. I run a business, Dominic. The taxes on these units—" "Shut up," Dominic said. It wasn't a shout. It was the absolute lack of volume that made Grigory's mouth snap shut so hard his teeth clicked. Dominic reached into his trousers. He pulled out the black leather money clip. He didn't count the bills. He just stripped off a thick stack of $100 notes and dropped them onto the desk next to the pink slip. "There's $3,000 there," Dominic said. "That covers her back rent. It covers her rent for the next 6 months, and it covers the cost of the new boiler you're going to have installed in number 48 by Friday afternoon." Grigory stared at the green pile of cash. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his gold chain. "Dominic, please. I did not know she was protected by your family. If I had known—" "She isn't," Dominic said coldly. "She's a nobody. But she feeds my father soup on Tuesday afternoons. That means when your idiot with the glass eye sits on her porch eating sunflower seeds, he's breathing air that belongs to me." Dominic leaned forward, resting his gloved forearms on the edge of the steel desk. "You turn the heat off at 10 o'clock again," Dominic murmured, his voice dropping into a register that sounded like grinding stones. "And I won't send Dean to break your collector's other knee. I'll call my friends at the Department of Licenses and Inspections. I'll have every single illegal multi-unit conversion you own in South Philly red-tagged by Monday morning. I'll have the fire marshal condemn your salvage yard for soil contamination. You'll be selling hot dogs out of a pushcart on Broad Street by February. Gregory sat frozen, his hands splayed flat on his thighs. The boiler will be fixed tomorrow morning, Dominic. I swear it on my mother. Leave the pink slip. Dominic said, standing up. And bring her the receipt for the rent, zero out yourself. If you look her in the eye when you hand it to her, I'll know. Dominic turned and walked out of the office. In the gravel yard, Dean was standing over Igor, who was sitting in the grey slush holding his ruined knee, his face pale and sweating in the winter cold. "We good, boss?" Dean asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "We're good?" Dominic said, getting into the Lincoln. "Let's go check on my mother's electric bill." At 6 o'clock that evening, the kitchen of number 44 smelled of toasted bread and warm butter. Dominic sat in his father's vinyl chair. Sam was asleep in the front room, the television murmuring softly about a local political indictment. Connie was at the sink, slowly washing a single ceramic plate with a sponge. The back door opened without a knock. A cold gust of wind swept across the linoleum floor. Dominic didn't reach for his waistband this time. He just watched the doorway. Tess stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing her track sweatshirt today. She wore a faded navy blue scrub top tucked into a pair of dark jeans. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her face scrubbed clean of the industrial bleach smell, but the dark purple shadows beneath her eyes looked deeper than they had the night before. She held a piece of white triplicate paper in her left hand. She stopped 3 feet from the table. She looked at Dominic, then looked at Connie at the sink. "Connie," Tess said quietly, "can you check on Sam for a minute? I think his blanket fell off." Connie looked over her shoulder, saw the absolute stillness between her son and the girl from 2 doors down, and quickly dried her hands on her apron. "Of course, honey. I'll go sit with him." The old woman hurried down the hallway, her slippers shuffling softly against the floorboards. When the kitchen was empty, Tess walked up to the Formica table and slapped the piece of white paper down right in front of Dominic. It was a stamped rental receipt from Vlasov Property Management, LLC. Balance, $0, paid in full through June. "Grigori brought that to my door 20 minutes ago," Tess said. Her voice was shaking, not with gratitude, but with a quiet, terrifying fury. "He looked like he was going to throw up on my welcome mat. He told me the heating guys are coming at 8 tomorrow morning to replace the baseboard units." Dominic didn't look at the receipt. He looked up at her face. "You're welcome. I didn't ask you for this," she breathed, stepping half a pace closer, her hands knotting into fists at her sides. "Do you understand what you just did? You think you solved a problem? You just made me a mobster's charity case in a neighborhood where everybody talks. Nobody talks about Grigori," Dominic said flatly. "Grigori is a coward." "I don't care about Grigori!" Tess snapped, her voice finally breaking its flat, controlled register. "I care about me. I care about my son. For 4 years I have paid my own way. I have worked 9 hours a day in a factory that smells like infected blood and bleach. I have counted pennies at the grocery store, so nobody could ever walk into my house and tell me I owe them something." She pointed a trembling finger at his chest. "Guys like you don't give away $3,000 for nothing?" she said, her eyes shining with unshed, angry tears. "What's the interest rate, Dominic? What happens in July when the rent comes due again? Do I run errands for you? Do I keep packages in my closet? What's the price for the boiler?" Dominic sat entirely still. He let her anger wash over him. He had seen men plead for their lives. He had seen politicians sweat through $2,000 suits when presented with photographs of their mistresses. He had never seen a woman furious because someone had turned her heat on. He stood up slowly. He didn't tower over her. He kept his hands at his sides, out of his pockets, entirely unthreatening. "There is no price," Dominic said quietly. "Bullshit. My father," Dominic said, his voice dropping into that raw, grounded space where he kept his own ghosts, "is dying of Parkinson's disease. My mother has bad knees and a bad heart. I have $6 million sitting in 3 different accounts in Delaware, and I can't walk into this house without my old man throwing a coffee cup at my head because he thinks my money is cursed. He stepped 1 inch closer to the table. You came in here, Dominic continued, pointing at the stove. You wiped his face. You made sure my mother didn't break her neck on the ice. In my business, Tess, when somebody protects your blood, you owe them a debt. I don't like unpaid debts. It keeps me awake at night. Tess stared at him, her chest heaving. I did it because they're old, not because I wanted your money. I know, Dominic said. That's why you got the boiler. The kitchen fell dead silent. The rain outside had stopped, leaving only the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of melting sleet falling from the gutter outside the window onto the concrete patio. Tess looked down at the zeroed-out receipt on the table. The anger seemed to drain out of her shoulders all at once, leaving behind the sheer, crushing exhaustion of a single mother who hadn't slept 7 consecutive hours since the Obama administration. She reached out, her fingers touching the edge of the paper. Gregory said the new boiler is gas, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. He said it heats the water faster. It does, Dominic said. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. A single tear escaped her left eyelash, cutting a clean, pale track down her cheek before she brushed it away fiercely with the back of her wrist. Sammy's dinosaur is still on the counter, she said, her voice returning to its flat, practical baseline as she turned toward the hallway. Tell your mother I'll be back tomorrow at 4 to check Sam's blood pressure. Tess, Dominic said before she reached the doorframe. She stopped, looking back over her shoulder. Buy the name-brand milk next time, Dominic said. The cheap stuff tastes like chalk. For a fraction of a second, the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Not quite a smile, but the recognition of a fellow survivor standing on the other side of the trenches. Then she was gone, the front door closing quietly behind her. By the 3rd week of January, the neighborhood had reached a silent, collective consensus. Nobody talked about the black Lincoln parked by the fire hydrant on the corner of Wharton. Nobody mentioned that the city plows, which usually left their narrow side street buried under 3 feet of dirty, compacted slush until March, suddenly cleared the asphalt down to the bare blacktop by 6 o'clock every morning. In South Philadelphia, survival was an exercise in selective blindness. You saw what kept you safe. You ignored what kept you alive. Dominic didn't go inside number 44 again. He stayed in the back of the sedan, watching through the tinted glass as Tess arrived at 3:45, her canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, holding Sammy by his mitten. 10 minutes later, Dean would walk across the street carrying a brown paper bag from the Italian market. Fresh seeded rolls, sharp provolone, a pound of sliced prosciutto, or a container of hot wedding soup. He would leave it on the wooden porch, knock twice, and walk away before Connie could open the door. It was an orderly system, balanced, predictable. Then came the second Tuesday in February. At 4:15, the porch of number 44 was empty. The brown paper bag containing 2 pounds of fresh ground veal sat on the top step, the grease from the meat slowly staining the bottom of the paper in the freezing air. In the driver's seat, Dean checked his watch. She's 20 minutes late. Dominic didn't look up from the tablet in his lap. He was reviewing the quarterly haulage numbers from a commercial waste facility in Camden. Her Civic probably wouldn't turn over. I drove past her building at noon, Dean said, his voice dropping an octave. The Honda wasn't there, but there was a 2004 Dodge Dakota parked in her spot. Front bumper held on with yellow cargo straps, New Jersey plates. Dominic's thumb stopped hovering over the screen. He didn't ask questions. In his world, a strange truck in a dedicated parking space wasn't a traffic violation. It was an unverified variable. And unverified variables eventually cost money. His phone buzzed in his overcoat pocket. The screen read, Connie, home. He hit accept, bringing the receiver to his ear. Ma, Donnie, his mother said. Her breath was coming in short, shallow catches, the sound of the television in her living room completely muted. "Donnie, you need to come inside. Right now." "I'm outside, Ma. What's wrong?" "It's the little boy," she whispered. Dominic shoved his door open before she finished the sentence. He crossed the street in 3 long strides, Dean right on his heels, his Carhartt jacket unzipped to clear his drawer. Dominic didn't use his shoulder this time. He turned the knob and walked into the narrow hallway. Sammy was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase. He wasn't wearing his winter coat. He had his little red light-up sneakers on the wrong feet, the Velcro straps hanging loose. His face was blotchy, his nose running, his hands clamped tightly over his ears. Standing over him was Sam. The old man had managed to get out of his vinyl chair. He was leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his left leg shaking so violently his slipper was slapping the hardwood floor, but his right hand, his good hand, was gripping the heavy brass handle of his cane like a baseball bat. "Donnie," Sam rasped, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "Get in the kitchen. Get your mother the phone." Dominic knelt in front of the kid. He didn't touch him. "Sammy, where's your mom?" The boy let out a ragged, hitching sob, his shoulders shaking. "The man took her purse. He threw the lamp." Dominic stood up. He looked at Dean. "Stay with my parents," Dominic said. "Boss, lock the front door behind me, Dean. Put Sam back in his chair. If anybody comes up those porch steps who doesn't look like me, put 2 through the wood." Dominic didn't wait for an answer. He went out the door, down the steps, and hit the sidewalk, moving at a fast, dead-level walk toward number 48. The air smelled of impending snow, that sharp, metallic ozone that makes your nostrils stick together. He reached the heavy glass entry door of Tessa's building. The lock wasn't engaged. The door was propped open by a shattered concrete landscaping brick. Dominic took his Sig Sauer out of his coat. He didn't rack the slide. He kept a round in the chamber as a rule of thumb. He held the weapon low against his right thigh, his overcoat draping over the dark metal, and took the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached the second-floor landing, he didn't need to check numbers. The hollow-core plywood door of apartment 2B was hanging open off its top hinge. The frame near the strike plate was splintered into raw, yellow toothpicks of pine where someone had kicked it through. From inside, a man's voice, thin, nasal, vibrating with the frantic, chemical energy of a 3-day methamphetamine bender, echoed into the stairwell. "I know you got it, Tessie. Don't lie to me. Gregori's guy told Jim at the bar that some union suit dropped $3,000 in cash to clear your ledger. You don't get $3,000 for washing hospital sheets. Where's the rest of it?" There was the sound of a plastic drawer being ripped out of a dresser and hurled against the wall. "Corey, stop!" Tessa's voice said. It wasn't the strong, grounded voice she used on Sam. It was thin, hoarse. The voice of a woman backed into a corner of her own kitchen. "There is no money. He paid the landlord directly. I never touched a cent of it." "Bullshit!" Dominic stepped through the broken doorframe. The apartment was tiny, a single main room with a kitchenette along the far wall and a mattress on the floor covered in dinosaur sheets. Tess was backed up against the kitchen sink. Her hair was down, tangled around her face, a dark red welt rising along her left cheekbone. Standing 3 feet from her was Corey Kincaid. He was wearing a greasy camouflage hoodie under a denim vest. He was skinny, the kind of hollowed-out, twitchy skinny that comes from replacing food with stimulants and gas station energy drinks. In his right hand, he held a heavy 12-inch flathead screwdriver he'd pulled out of a toolbox on the counter. He heard Dominic's boots on the linoleum and spun around, raising the screwdriver like a prison shank. "Who the hell are—" Corey started. He stopped. He looked at the 6'2" frame filling the doorway. He looked at the tailored $5,000 charcoal overcoat. Then his eyes dropped to the black, matte-finished Sig Sauer hanging casually against Dominic's right trouser leg. The chemical fire in Corey's pupils extinguished instantly, replaced by the primitive, cold-water clarity of prey, realizing it had wandered into a predator's den. "Put the tool on the counter," Dominic said. His voice didn't echo in the small apartment. It absorbed the sound. It was the absolute baseline of human communication. No anger, no theatrical threat, just an instruction issued by a man who had never had an instruction disobeyed twice. Corey's Adam's apple jerked up and down his scrawny neck. His eyes darted to the shattered doorway behind Dominic, calculating the distance, calculating the spread of a 9mm hollow point at 8 feet. "Look, man," Corey stammered, his voice dropping into a desperate, fast-talking whine. "This is a domestic situation, all right? This is my wife. That's my kid's room. I got legal rights to be here." Dominic took 2 steps forward. He didn't raise the gun. He just closed the physical distance until he was standing 4 feet from the skinny man in the camouflage hoodie. The smell of stale sweat, cheap tobacco, and chemical paranoia radiating off Corey was overwhelming. "She isn't your wife," Dominic said. "She's Teresa Kincaid. You abandoned her 4 years ago. You left her with a broken bone and a hospital bill." Corey's hand shook. The tip of the flathead screwdriver wobbled in the air. "Who are you? Her pimp? You her boyfriend?" "I'm Sam Bruno's son," Dominic said. The name hit Corey like a physical blow to the sternum. Even 4 years in Arizona hadn't erased the basic geography of South Philadelphia. You didn't need to read the newspapers to know who Sam Bruno was. You just needed to know which union halls didn't allow state troopers inside the doors. Corey's fingers went numb. The screwdriver slipped out of his grip, hitting the Formica counter with a loud, dull clack before rolling onto the floor. "I didn't know," Corey whispered, his hands coming up to his chest, palms facing outward. "Jesus, man, I didn't know she was with the Brunos. Jim didn't say nothing about no Brunos?" Dominic didn't look at the screwdriver. His cold, dark eyes stayed locked onto Corey's pupils. "Take your wallet out," Dominic said. Corey blinked. "What?" "Your wallet. Take it out of your jeans." Corey reached trembling fingers into his back pocket and pulled out a cheap nylon Velcro wallet. "Tess," Dominic said, without breaking eye contact with Corey. "Take his keys off the counter." Tess moved along the edge of the sink. She didn't look at her ex-husband. She reached out, grabbed a set of brass keys attached to a faded red lanyard, and pulled them to her chest. "How much money do you have in that wallet, Corey?" Dominic asked. $40, Corey choked out. "Maybe 50. Dominic reached into his overcoat with his left hand. He pulled out his leather money clip. He peeled off $500 bills and held them out. "This is $500, Dominic said. "There is a Greyhound bus leaving the terminal on Filbert Street for Phoenix, Arizona at 6:30 tonight. A one-way ticket costs $185. That leaves you $315 for food and methamphetamine." Corey stared at the money, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "You are going to walk out of this building," Dominic said, his voice dropping into that quiet, grinding register that made men's knees turn to water. "You are going to walk to Broad Street? You are going to get on the subway to City Hall? You are going to buy the ticket? If your Dodge Dakota is still parked in that lot at 5 o'clock, I will have Dean put it in the industrial crusher at Snyder Avenue with your luggage inside it." Dominic leaned forward an inch. "If I ever see your face in Pennsylvania again," Dominic whispered. "If I ever hear that you called her phone, if I ever find out you sent a letter to my mother's house, I won't kill you, Corey. Killing people brings paperwork. I will have Dean take you down to the basement of the linen plant. I will put both of your hands into the industrial mangle press. You will spend the rest of your natural life drinking your meals through a plastic straw. Do you understand me?" Corey didn't speak. He couldn't. He just nodded violently, tears of sheer pathetic terror spilling over his lower eyelids. Dominic dropped the $500 onto the floor at Corey's feet. "Pick it up," Dominic said, "and get out." Corey dropped to his knees, his trembling hands scrambling over the linoleum to gather the green notes. He stuffed them into his front pocket, scrambled back onto his feet, and bolted past Dominic, his shoulders hunched, his boots slipping on the broken door frame as he fled down the stairwell. The heavy entry door downstairs slammed shut. Dominic stood in the center of the rec department. He engaged the thumb safety on his Sig Sauer with a soft click and slid the weapon back into his waistband. He turned around. Tess was still standing by the sink. She hadn't moved. She was staring at the spot on the floor where her ex-husband had just been kneeling. Her breath was coming in long, ragged shudders, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles were translucent. "He's gone," Dominic said quietly. Tess didn't look at him. "He'll come back when the money runs out." "No, he won't," Dominic said. "Cowards believe in pain. He believes me." She looked up then. Her eyes took in his face. The absolute lack of adrenaline, the calm, terrifying certainty of a man who managed violence the way an accountant managed tax brackets. "You shouldn't have given him money," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He didn't deserve your money." "It wasn't a gift," Dominic said. "It was an eviction fee. It's cheaper than paying somebody to dig a hole in the frozen dirt." He walked over to the closet, picked up Sammy's small winter coat off a hook, and laid it across her arm. "Come on," Dominic said. "My mother has the veal on the stove. Sammy's waiting for his shoes." By late March, the dirty snowbanks along Wharton Street had finally melted into grey, brackish puddles that reflected the pale spring sunlight. It was a Sunday afternoon. The dining room table at number 44 was covered in a white lace tablecloth that Connie only pulled out of the cedar chest for Easter and funerals. In the center sat a massive ceramic bowl of rigatoni with Sunday gravy, surrounded by platters of fried cutlets, roasted peppers, and crusty bread from the bakery down the block. Sam sat at the head of the table. His Parkinson's hadn't vanished. There are no cinematic miracles in South Philadelphia. His head still carried a slight, rhythmic tremor, and his left hand was tucked quietly into his lap, out of sight. But his face had gained back some of its color. He wore a clean white button-down shirt, the collar buttoned to the top. To his right sat Sammy. The boy was furiously devouring a chicken cutlet with his fingers, his face smeared with red sauce. Beside his plate sat a finished drawing. The Tyrannosaurus Rex was completely filled in with solid, heavy strokes of green crayon, complete with jagged red teeth and a little stick figure of a man being stepped on by its massive hind foot. "Look, Uncle Donnie," Sammy said, holding the paper up. "He squished the bad guy." Dominic sat at the opposite end of the table from his father. He took a sip of his seltzer. He looked at the drawing, then looked at the kid. "Looks like clean work, Sammy. No witnesses." "Donnie, don't teach the boy criminal slang at the dinner table." Connie scolded from the kitchen door, though she was smiling as she carried in a plate of cannoli. "Teresa, honey, sit down. You've been on your feet all day." Tess came out of the kitchen holding a fresh pitcher of ice water. She looked different. The deep, bruised exhaustion beneath her eyes hadn't completely disappeared. Working mothers don't magically regenerate. But the sharp, defensive edge in her jaw had softened. She wore a simple grey sweater, her dark hair falling freely over her shoulders. She set the pitcher down and took the chair between Sammy and Dominic. "Gregory called me this morning," Tess said quietly, passing the bread basket to Dominic. Dominic took a slice. "Yeah? He said the building ownership changed," she said, her dark eyes locking onto his. "He said a commercial trust out of Wilmington bought number 48. He told me my unit, 2B, was converted to a permanent equity lease, fully paid off. He said the deed is registered in a living trust for Samuel Kincaid, with me listed as the primary trustee." Sam stopped chewing his bread. He looked across the table at his son. Connie paused with the cannoli tongs in her hand. Dominic didn't look up from his plate. He carefully buttered his crusty bread. "Sounds like Gregory finally got a decent tax attorney. Multi-unit conversions are a liability. It's smart business to offload the equity to long-term tenants." "Dominic," Tess said. Her voice was steady, but there was a sudden, fierce brightness in her eyes. "A 3-story row house on that block is worth $240,000. Not with the plumbing it has," Dominic said flatly. The pipes are galvanized steel from 1952. Whoever owns that trust is gonna have to drop 20 grand just to replace the main line to the street before the city inspectors catch it." He looked up at her then. "Luckily," Dominic added, his voice entirely deadpan. "I know a guy at the plumbing union who owes my father a favor from the garbage strike in '88. He'll do the labor at cost." Sam let out a low, rough sound from the head of the table. It started as a dry cough, rattled in his damaged lungs, and finally broke into a genuine, wheezing laugh. "You're a slick bastard, Donny," the old man rasped, shaking his head. 30 years I tried to teach you how to handle people, and you buy a woman a house just so you don't have to listen to her complain about the heating oil. Eat your rigatoni, old man," Dominic said, "before your hand starts shaking and you ruin the tablecloth." Sam didn't throw a cup. He didn't curse. He reached out with his trembling right hand, took the heavy serving spoon, and clumsily dropped 3 extra meatballs onto Dominic's plate. "Eat," Sam commanded. "You look skinny. Those fancy restaurants in Center City don't feed you enough." After dinner, while Connie and Sammy were in the living room watching a nature documentary, Dominic stepped out onto the back concrete patio to get some fresh air. The sun was setting, painting the brick chimneys of the neighborhood a deep, bruised shade of purple. The screen door squeaked open behind him. Tess stepped out onto the concrete. She didn't have a coat on, but the spring air was mild enough that she didn't shiver. She stood next to him, leaning her hips against the wooden railing, looking out over the tiny, fenced-in yard. "I won't work for you," she said quietly. "I don't have any laundry that needs washing," Dominic replied. "I mean it, Dominic. I won't hold money. I won't make phone calls. If you ever ask me to do something that puts my son in danger, I will sell that apartment for $50 and move to Ohio." Dominic turned his head to look at her. In his world, women looked at him with either fear, calculated ambition, or the desperate, clinging hope that his money could shield them from reality. Tess looked at him the way Dean looked at him, like a dangerous, highly effective piece of heavy machinery that required careful handling and absolute honesty. "I don't need employees, Tess," Dominic said softly. "I have 200 guys on payroll who would jump off the Walt Whitman Bridge if I told them the water was warm. What I don't have is somebody who tells my father to shut his mouth when he refuses his medication." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, blunt piece of green wax, and set it on the wooden railing between them. It was Sammy's green crayon. "Keep the kid practicing," Dominic said, turning back toward the screen door. "His shading is getting better." Tess looked down at the crayon on the wood. She picked it up, her fingers closing tightly over the paper label, and looked back at the tall man in the dark clothes stepping back into the warm, garlic-scented light of his parents' kitchen. For the first time in 4 years, she didn't check the locks on the door behind her. What would you do if you found out your family's greatest protector was a complete stranger? Dominic Bruno thought loyalty could only be bought with cash or enforced by fear, but Tess Kincaid proved that real power isn't about who you control. It's about who you protect when nobody is watching. If this gritty, deeply human story of survival, family, and unexpected second chances hit you right in the chest, do us a massive favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates real storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded audio dramas every single week. Leave a comment below. Did Dominic do the right thing by Corey? See you in the next one.